Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. Well, my guest today to kick off Season 4 is Kyle Worley. He's a pastor, author, teacher, and host of the Knowing Faith podcast alongside Jen Wilkin and JT English. Kyle and I are going to talk about his pitch to start a completely different podcast that evolved into Knowing Faith, the process they went through to come up with the podcast's title, and how the podcast has led to live events and other ministry opportunities. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Kyle Worley. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hey, Tim, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you and your co-host started Knowing Faith back in August of 2017, which has now published over 425 episodes, and the description of the podcast reads, "The Christian faith is not mindless or irrational. Knowing Faith is a podcast exploring how our faith is founded upon Scripture. We believe the Bible is for everyone, and we are committed to helping the church understand where their faith is rooted." Hosted by Jen Wilkin, JT English, Kyle Worley, this podcast dives into Christian story, belief, and practice in a way that is accessible to everyone. So I'm so glad to have you on the podcast today, Kyle, to hear about your podcasting journey. So let's take a look back about the progress that has happened over the 8+ years at this point. How has having a podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. When we started the podcast, we really started it as just kind of a church-facing, local church-serving resource, which is often encouragement I give, particularly to people serving within a church that want to start a podcast, is, hey, build for the people that are in front of you. And that's what we did. When we initially set kind of our success metrics, like what our goals were, we were hoping that we would have 1,500 listeners that were from our church. That was like what we thought success would be like. Knowing Faith now reaches an audience of close to 250,000 people a month. And so it was certainly not why we didn't build it to do that. We built it to engage and resource our church effectively. But if the people in your church are normal people, and most churches are filled with normal people, and you build something that engages normal people effectively, and you can offer it, with the kind of quality that is commensurate with your resources and your goals, then yeah, it will stretch. And it certainly has amplified our ability to bring kind of our core message, which our core messaging is biblical literacy, theological literacy, and brother-sister culture in the church. Those are our three distinctives. We knew that from early on. That was what we wanted to be about. There's a lot of things Knowing Faith doesn't cover that we won't cover, and that's by design because we want to amplify those three things. And certainly it has done that for all three of us.
Nice. Yeah. So which came first, the ministry, training the church, which the podcast is part of, or the podcast itself?
Yeah, it was the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, we were all three serving at the same local church together, and we built the podcast there. Then on the basis of the podcast growth, as it reached a wider and wider audience, we realized that we needed, in order to serve that audience, it just made sense to pull that podcast out from kind of being embedded within that specific local church itself into a wider ministry umbrella that could serve churches across the country. And so Training the Church is kind of the umbrella banner. It's the LLC. It's the business name for a larger suite of services and deliverables, of which the podcast is kind of the flagship.
Nice. Yeah, so obviously this had to be somebody's idea. So with the three of you, whose idea was it to start a podcast, and what was that pitch?
Yeah, well, it was my idea to start the podcast.
Yeah.
And I dragged JT and Jen in reluctant. I mean, kicking and screaming. Neither of them believed that the podcast would be viable, profitable, or fruitful. And I don't blame them. This podcast launched out in 2017. It felt like at the time, I really thought we were at the peak of podcast boom at 2017. Now, after 8 years of being very actively in the game, I don't think that we're even close to reaching the peak of what podcasting is and what it could be. And there's a number of reasons we can get into why that is. But at the time, it felt like for Jen and JT, I just don't know that they believed in the medium. In Christian circles, when you think about resourcing and publishing, it's really been curriculum and books.
Sure.
Curriculum and books have led the way. I mean, the sermons certainly dominated the podcast feeds in the early aughts. So like most Christian leaders thought, okay, I can see putting sermons online. I can see writing books or blogs, and I can see the value in curriculum, video-based curriculum or print-based curriculum. But podcasts at the time, I think were still a little bit of is it really worth doing? And if so, like, wouldn't you just put your sermons up? So I went and pitched our director of communications and said, hey, I know we have the sermon feed. I really do think that Jen and JT and I, who were actively teaching in the church at that time in a number of environments, the conversations we're having would be fruitful for people to hear. A lot of people just see the finished product. You just see the finished sermon.
Sure.
You see the finished book. You see the finished lecture. There's all these conversations and reflections that go on. And I think that showing that process would be really helpful for just ordinary Christians. This is like how you get to biblical and theological clarity. Mm-hmm. And our director of communications immediately bought in on it, was like, yes. Then I went upstairs, very excited, and told JT and Jen, who were office right across the hall from me, I said, guys, I got a great idea. Went to Jen first. And I said, Jen, I got a great idea. Because when I initially pitched the show, Tim, it was not Knowing Faith. It was the Jen Wilkins Show.
Okay.
And I was just going to produce it. So I came to Jen and said, I got a show. You're going to have a podcast. I'm going to produce it for you. And here's what it'll be. It's going to be great. And she said, absolutely not. I am not going to do that. And she said, the only way I'd consider it is if you and JT agreed to it. I said, got it. I walked across the hall, told JT and said, JT, I've got a great idea for the entrepreneur immediately pivots. I walked across the hall and said, JT, I have a great idea for a podcast. It's going to be a show with me, you, and Jen on it. I'm going to host it. And we're going to talk about Bible and doctrine together. And he said, you know what? Maybe. I just don't think anybody will listen to it. I said, I promise you people will listen to this show. I promise you people are going to listen to it. They're going to be interested. We're going to have a blast with it. He said, okay. He was the head of our department at the time. He said, I'll commit to doing 4 episodes. We'll record 4 episodes. And if they're trash and nobody likes them, it's dead in the water. We're never going to air it. I said, okay. So that's how we went into it, with a commitment to do 4 episodes. Our first season, I think, was 10 episodes maybe total. And after the first episode we recorded, like in the studio, nobody had heard it, JT and Jen both turned to me and said, that was a ton of fun. And I said, I told you, we're going to have a great time doing this. We're now 400 episodes in, and we're still having as much fun. And obviously the audience has grown significantly since then. Yeah. But so, yeah, it originally started me pitching the show as a Jen Wilkins show, her saying no, me walking across the hall, pivoting the concept immediately to a joint show between the 3 of us as friends. And that's what ended up sticking, and that's what endured. So
nice. Yeah, that's a really cool backstory. And so how did you come to the name Knowing Faith as part of, you're figuring out, okay, I was going to do Jen, and now I'm going to be all 3 of us building the concept that had quickly pivoted, as you were saying. How did all that come together?
We were working at a church at the time. They had a communications department. So there were like people that were involved in these kinds of discussions. So we had a meeting. We came to that meeting. We had a lot of like thoughts on what it could be. We knew we wanted to talk predominantly about the Bible and Christian theology. We wanted it to be accessible for people. And we wanted it to be like warm and fun and engaging. And we wanted it to feel active. And so Jen was very fond of riffing off of this quote from Augustine, the heart can't love what the mind doesn't know. That's something that she had published in Women of the Word. It's a bit of a paraphrase from something that St. Augustine had said, and that honestly, many writers and thinkers throughout the history of the church had said something similar. We were also thinking about this quote from Anselm, another early church father, which is faith seeking understanding. So this idea of like faith, we move in faith towards understanding the world around us. And so we kind of took those 2 ideas together, and through a number of iterations came up with Knowing Faith. We felt like it was congruent with the goal. It was grounded in these great quotes from Augustine and Anselm. It also was a homage to J.I. Packer's wonderful book, Knowing God, which is kind of a contemporary Christian classic. And faith was broad enough to encompass story, the Bible text itself, and Christian doctrine. So that's how we landed on it. Was Knowing Faith was just kind of a nod to some of the fundamental influences on us, Anselm, Augustine, Jack Packer, an acknowledgement of some things we'd been working out real time in conversation, and was in line with the goal of what we wanted to do, which was to serve the audience by providing an introduction to the Bible and Christian belief.
Yeah. And obviously that title has stood out for so long because of the success of the show. But like, that's a great way to walk through it. So if you're listening, you're wanting to start a ministry podcast and you're trying to figure out the title, you need to put some time into it. Like Kyle's saying, you got to have some meetings with people that you trust, run it by them. Hey, this is what I'm thinking. Figure out what you're wanting to do with the show. And then, okay, how does the title encapsulate that and make it something that's easily identifiable and make people want to click play on it? I mean, really, that's what it comes down to, right?
Well, it's funny, Tim, because we actually ended up, so Knowing Faith we had a really great meeting where we landed on a title for the show on the same path that I was talking about. So and we landed on this title for the show, Reasonable Faith. Now, maybe some of your listeners will know, if they've been involved in Christian resourcing, they might sound familiar to them. So we left that meeting, we're high-fiving each other. We're like, Reasonable Faith, that's awesome. Man, what a great title. And somebody who worked in our comms department said, great, let me just make sure that there's no IP out there or whatever on Reasonable Faith. Well, it turns out that Reasonable Faith is widely established IP for William Lane Craig, who's like an apologist. He's a Christian writer who's written a number of books, one of which sold a lot, and it's called Reasonable Faith, who also had a podcast at the time called Reasonable Faith. So we came back to the drawing board and we said, let's go through the whole process again. So it was another 2-hour meeting, and we landed on Knowing Faith. So yeah, I'm going to double down on what Tim said there. Definitely work out your name idea with some people. Make it true to what the goal of the show is, crowdsource it with people you trust, and then before you click publish, go online and double check. Is there another entity, person, or organization operating in your same area of interest in publishing that is using that title or something very close to it? If so, you may want to really think about doing something different. So
don't want to create confusion for sure. So I'm sure the equipment and technology that you used back at the very beginning in 2017 has changed quite a bit over time. Now, I know you've used the RE20s for a while, the microphone that's sitting in front of you right now, but tell me a little bit about that progression. What did you start with? How did that evolve over time to where you are at now?
Man, okay. I've never gotten a chance to talk about all this stuff. Most of the time I show up on podcasts, it's all about like the book that we wrote or like a theological topic. So this is fun. Okay. When we started in 2017, we were doing Studio Bay. So we were like in a studio at the church building. We were recording in person, engineer in the other room, soundproof room. We were using, I don't know if we were using these RE20s. Yeah. I don't know that we were using these, but we were using something similar to them. We had an engineer over there and they were doing real time. So that was all happening right there. We recorded in person. Over the years in 2020, when we actually pulled the podcast out of the church we were at and pulled it under Training the Church, one of the hosts of the show, JT, moved to Colorado. This was also during COVID stuff. So we moved to a distance-based recording because now he was in a different state than Jen and I were. And so we moved to using initially Squadcast. Yeah. We were doing Squadcast, was kind of our portal. And I forget what interface we were using to run the mics into the computer. But as of today, we're using the RE20 into a Vocaster 1, and we record out of Riverside. Nice. So that's kind of our system right now. And we've really, I know you're recording out of Riverside. I got to say, as bang for your buck, Riverside has been the best online portal experience we've had for capturing these podcasts. Their customer service team has been like top notch. There have been times when I'm like, we've lost something that is really like hard to get back, and they're able to go and get it. I mean, they've been really responsive. They've taken a lot of user notes on improving the system. And I've had no problem with the RE20 or the Vocaster 1. Super easy to use. Yeah. So that's been it. Now, I got to be honest with you, Tim. I did not set up all this system, and I would be remiss to not give a shout out to the Good Podcast Company. They're the guys that run our back end, and they have always kept us up to speed and current with what's going on. So
nice. And y'all have worked with them since the beginning, or did that? It started out as the church piece of the church, and then it kind of evolved from there.
That's right. Yeah. So the guy who started the Good Podcast Company, Brad Weigel,
Yeah.
he was our producer and engineer at the Village. And he was running, like he was doing production at the Village more broadly. And he was assigned to these kinds of resources like the podcast. So he was the guy running the studio for us. Then when we went independent outside of the church that we had built the podcast at, we asked Brad, like, hey, could we take you on as a contractor? We started off the only one. And then they have been able to build a book of business to where they're now doing a number of podcasts, of which we're just a part now of their much larger system. So they brought on some other guys on that team. Chris Sterrett's on that team. They've done fantastic work for us over the years. I mean, really consistent. So we love working with them.
Yeah, I've gotten an opportunity to chat with Brad and see all of the work that they're doing. It's really cool. So I noticed that the podcast, you're talking about 2020 and training the church. The podcast wasn't on Instagram until July of 2020. And I was curious about that. What made it wait 3 years before creating a social presence?
Yeah, good question. So part of it is that Jen, JT, and I we are really good at the content. Communication has never been I don't know that Knowing Faith, your audience knows now that to build video forward is a no-brainer, and Knowing Faith is still not building video forward. So we are behind the 8 ball. I'm sure about the moment we get on video forward, everybody will be like, oh, now we're moving back to audio. We've always been behind the communications and media ball. I think what keeps our audience has been content and credibility. That we know where we're at, but we've grown. Why did we wait till 2020? Well, because the church required it. It was one of the reasons we pulled the resource out of the church. When you're a church, you have a lot of projects going on. What they did not want to do is, we were at a large church and everybody wanted their own social media handle. Like the youth ministry, the kids ministry, the recovery ministry, the groups ministry. So they just said, no, we're going to have our church media handle and a resources media handle. And we were just a small part of a larger resource ministry. Knowing Faith had grown so significantly that it just was beginning to outgrow the pot it had been planted in. So we actually came to the Village and said, can we buy this IP from you? It felt like good stewardship to do that, just because, gosh, they had invested in it. And so we pulled it independent. We purchased that. It was a great, friendly business transaction. It wasn't bad blood at all. And once we did that, we were like, you know what? We do need to have a social presence, because we're now no longer flying under the larger kind of social umbrella of the church, which was very large. So we established it then. And gosh, go back and look at the Instagram if you want a journey through a group of people who have no idea how to do social media promotion on a podcast and are learning real time. I mean, you can literally see the duct tape and chicken wire on our, so it was not a professional launch. It was just we got to get it out there and let's start just going. So it was very much a ship it kind of mentality when it came to establishing ourselves in social media land.
Yeah. And you're talking about, the video first idea of people recording video and kind of catering to that as being the primary. And then you have the audio that you put on podcasts, but you also put it on YouTube or on Spotify as well. But you also, you're not doing the full episodes on video, but you're doing social clips, which is what I recommend people do, right? So awareness is huge in podcasting, and just knowing that shows exist, because that's not being served up on the platforms, which is a pro and a con, depending on how you look at it. But it just enables you to get out in front of more people, and people are consuming video content on social platforms. And so it makes it really easy to pull some stuff from the episode. Specifically, if you're using Riverside, it's real easy to capture all the audio and video, and then cut those up, throw them up as clips. And that's what I recommend people do. If you're not interested in doing video full, the full video thing, which I don't do for my podcast because it takes a lot more work. But having the social clips is a huge piece to just getting the word out, getting awareness that, hey, this podcast exists and we have a new episode out, or, whatever else, and pique interest to keep people coming back to the show. So as part of this kind of conversation recently, back in September of last year, I noticed that the album artwork that had been the same since the very beginning got a facelift, and you posted about that on social media, and it now includes your faces and your names and not just Knowing Faith in bold letters with the open Bible there. And I think the rebrand looks great, but what led to that change?
Gosh, This is one of the most fun interviews I've ever done because I love talking about this stuff and I never get asked about it. And you've done your homework. Thank you, Tim. Okay. So we rebranded it for a couple of reasons. One, it just has become clear that in the more visual forward podcast age, people want to see the faces of the talkers. That's it. So even if you've got a face made for podcasts like me, it doesn't hurt you to put it out there now. Get a good headshot done and find a way to get it. And so we went through a lot of mock-ups to try to get a redesign. And we knew we wanted to capture the spirit of what had been there previously, but we knew we wanted to attach a name and a face component. It's not surprising that in an age of so much content now, the audience is looking for things that feel like there's a credible connection that's offered. I think people will watch a 60-second AI generated video. That's clear. Now, what they will not do is if they're going to give you their loyal listening, I think they want to feel like they know you, and putting your face on stuff helps make that connection. So we fought it, Tim. Like we really did, because we were like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But we had actually JT English, one of the hosts of the show, his wife, Macy, is like a professional in online marketing.
Yeah.
And she was just like, you guys need to make this change. And she drove it for us. And she was absolutely right. The response has been great. And I think it looks better. It looks more like it needed a facelift, like no pun intended. It needed to be refreshed. And I'm glad that we did it. So that's kind of what went into it. I do think if you look at a lot of the podcasts now that are really thriving, the graphics typically, I think particularly in religious or storytelling spaces, you can see that a lot of podcasts are moving to this format to make that kind of embodied connection, you might say.
Yeah, exactly. When I used to work at Ramsey Solutions and there were conversations about, new shows starting or books coming out and do we put the face on, do we not? Dave Ramsey would always say, people connect with people. So that's why we're putting faces on books. Like that's the reason. And just like you're saying, people connect with people. That's how you start that relationship. You see the face on there, you hear their voice, you build that trust. It just kind of repeats.
That reminds me of something. There's a guy out at Ligonier, which is a large Christian resourcing ministry in Florida. And I'm blanking on this brother's name. He said something a number of years ago in a blog article that really shaped how we think about the voice of the podcast. And that I think also speaks to what you're talking about here, which is that people connect with people and pixels are people. Basically, like when you see a photo of a real person, like there's a real person. And that photo isn't that real person, but it's a picture of that real person. And I think it's important in an internet age when it's so easy to dehumanize people and projects and products to really try to put a human face on these things, not just so that you can sell it more effectively, but so that we can remember the voices that are talking to you are the voices of real human people. I guess when they are the voices of real human people. When they're the voices of robots, they're not the voices of real human people. Which is not something we had to say 10 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. It's come a long way. For better or for worse. I've noticed that the podcast has now overflowed into some other spaces. You've had live events. You've done a cohort with Training the Church. Tell me about that progression.
Yeah. So when your message starts to resonate with people, and it will, like if you deliver it like in a reliable way that's predictable and accessible, like your message will find an audience. And it might not be an audience of 500,000, but if you find a dedicated audience of 500, they're going to ask you for more connection points. And then you have to think about what can you offer that's within the scope of your message and congruent with the goals that you have or goals for the resource and are within the scale of your resources. Like what can you actually pull off at a high quality level? And we found that a lot of questions we would get as we would tell our story about what God was doing in our ministry at our church, people would message in and say, hey, I'd really love to come and observe that. And the number of requests we were getting was so high that we were like, you know what? We can't just keep granting these on a one-off basis because it'll be just tremendous time. But what we can do is we can consolidate that. So we consolidated into what's called the Train the Church Ministry Cohort. You can find out about that at trainthechurch.com. It's an online class that helps church leaders think about how to build a ministry philosophy to build the disciples. In addition to that, as we developed partnerships with other conferences and publishers and organizations, we started to get asked to do live events. The first live recording we ever did was for an event here in Dallas called Proclaim Truth. It was a women's conference. It ran for maybe 5 or 6 years. I don't think they're still running it. But they asked us, Jen was the speaker, and they said, would y'all come do a live recording of Knowing Faith? And I had been itching for an opportunity. I'm a huge fan of podcasts and have gone to a number of live podcast recordings. I believe in the format.
Yeah.
And I also have a bit of an improv background. And so I was like, you know what? This is going to be a blast. And JT and Jen were like, this is going to be a disaster. And it was a ton of fun. I mean, we had a great time. So we said, you know what? Let's keep doing that. So we've now done, I don't know, 6 or 7 of these live recordings, and we've had a lot of fun doing it. It's a great way. I think live recordings are a great way to meet your audience and to hear from them and to invite them really in to the conversation that your show is facilitating. So I always tell podcasts, once you start clipping into like if you have a region where you have a large pocket of listeners and you're starting to get over the north of 10,000, 15,000 download listener threshold, and you can identify in your dashboards like where those listeners are at, I strongly encourage, if you can, to partner with somebody to pull off a live recording. I tell podcasts, get in there, do it. I know, do it as cheap and as bootstrapped as you can if you need to, but you'll really enjoy it. If you can get 100 people to a live recording of a podcast, you will build, and you can pull it off even remotely well. Those 100 people will leave as your most loyal listeners, and they will share that podcast with everybody.
Yeah, that's a really cool perspective from being on that side. What would you say are some other opportunities that have come up because you've had a podcast to meet other listeners, to get in front of more people? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the podcast has created space for us to have a megaphone for like book projects, right?
Exactly.
Like, I mean, I don't know how much you want to get into this. Publishers are looking, especially Christian publishers, are looking for you to have communication channels already. Like that limits the liability for them significantly. If you have an interest in like when somebody tells me they have an interest in writing a book, I'm like, do you have a podcast and a newsletter? If you don't have a podcast and a newsletter, build your podcast and newsletter and start workshopping your material right now. And building an audience, like, cause they are going to ask you, do you have communication channels? And if you don't, it's going to be harder to get that book out there, no matter how good the book is. So the podcast has certainly given us a megaphone to talk about our other projects and to allow publishers and partners to have more, like, to be more ready to buy in on giving us a chance to get our message out in more traditional spaces.
Nice. Yeah. Who are the people that you've learned from the most in your podcasting journey over the past 8+ years as you've developed the show and gotten it to where it is today? Who are those people and what did they teach you?
Yeah, Kent Rabelais is one of those guys. Kent works now for a group called Wonder Road. It does film production. He was working at the Village at the time. But Kent is a fantastic guy, consults with creatives. You can find him on LinkedIn and find him on social media, but he's wonderful. I learned a tremendous amount from Kent Rabelais in terms of how to build deliverables that tell stories. And your podcast needs to tell a story. I don't know what the story will be, but it needs to tell a story. So I think that's one. Another person I've learned from is Jen, one of my co-hosts on the show. Jen is really a big contribution she's made to discipleship ministry broadly has been that it's important for churches to identify a scope. What are they going to teach and what are they not going to teach? So very early on at Knowing Faith, Jen said, what is this show going to be about? Define a scope for what this show is going to cover and what's not going to cover. And that has helped us tremendously. We don't do current events on Knowing Faith. Like, it doesn't matter how many DMs we get asking us to commentate on something that happened last week. It doesn't happen. We batch record most of our episodes because we're building them to be evergreen. You should be able to dive into an episode of Knowing Faith 15 years from now and it not feel dated. We built it saying we're going to talk about Christian story, Christian belief, and Christian formation. Those things never age. They'll never go out of need. So that's what we cover. So she was really helpful. That wasn't podcast specific, but it certainly helped structure the content of the show. I would say in terms of the podcast like world, I learned a lot from observation. The guys I really, and I'm not endorsing anything and everything that's been said on all of these shows. I want to be super clear about that for your audience. This is not an endorsement of these shows or the content of these shows. These are things I learned from the format, structure, or culture of these shows that I was inspired by. But Reply All was a podcast that I felt like absolutely nailed commentating, storytelling, fun, and they pulled the audience into what can feel like arcane material or really like technical material, and they did so in an accessible way. I thought they did that really well, and they gave me a template for doing that on our show. I learned a lot from how they built out that show, content-wise and flow-wise. There was a podcast that was out for a long time that was a three-way conversation between two guys and a woman, and it was not about theology, but it was about literature. And the way they talked to one another, I could tell that they created space for the person who was most knowledgeable, but they never treated the most knowledgeable person as a sage. I don't think sage podcasts work very effectively. Like, I'm the question asker, you're the sage. That now feels like now you've just tricked me into a kind of lecture. Not a conversation.
Sure.
I think a conversation needs to be where everybody treats each other as peers, even if one of them is more of a subject matter expert. That can happen with two people. I think it really thrives with more than two. And so, I learned a lot from that pod, which I've forgotten the name of, but it was also a good demonstration of going, I want to build Knowing Faith to where even if Jen is the most knowledgeable on the topic, I'm okay pushing back on what she says if I disagree with her. And the same for me. That I think that you need to have that kind of conversational comfortability.
Nice. Yeah, that's great insight. Great learning. So what are you most excited about for the future of Training the Church as a ministry and then Knowing Faith as a podcast?
Yeah, so for Training the Church, I felt like we have built out what we had set out to build out. We, a number of years ago, had a meeting where we said we wanted to build out a podcast network. We wanted to have Knowing Faith be the flagship. We wanted to have an online cohort that we had turned into an online class, and we wanted to have published the Deep Discipleship Program. We've now done all four of those things. So really now it's just about cultivating those things. Every podcast we launched on the network, we've now rolled off to be its own independent show. And so we launched 4 other podcasts behind Knowing Faith. And the goal was to invest in voices we believed in, get them into where they were cost neutral. So they were able to generate enough revenue on the show to where it didn't cost them to run the show. And we would use any profits in our profit share program to fund the other shows that we were starting up. So we spun that flywheel for 5 years, and all of those shows are still out there. They're cost neutral. They're able to run these shows, and we were able to use the funds, any profit we generated from those shows, to invest in other startup shows. So that feels like, gosh, we did it. We're thrilled that those shows exist and are thriving out there on their own. And it's fun to just see them continue to grow their audience. We launched the cohort, which we really built for ministry leaders. You can find that at trainthechurch.com. We're really proud of that. If you're a ministry leader listening to this and you're trying to think through how do we build a culture of deep discipleship and resource the disciples in our church, we have a class that you and your leadership can go through at your own self-pace. It comes with quarterly live calls with Jen, JT, and I, where we answer the alumni-based questions and make it contextual for your church. So you can find that at trainthechurch.com. And then we worked with Lifeway to publish what's called the Deep Discipleship Program, which is a year-long theological discipleship program, comes with all the books, all the video teachings. And that is really our most church-facing curriculum that you'll find from the three of us. And we're really proud of how that turned out. You can go to lifeway.com/deep discipleship. So we have a planning meeting in February, Tim, where we're sitting down and we're going, what's the future of the show? My pitch is I'm coming in with I'll tell it here first because I know Jen and JT won't hear it here. But what I'm coming in to pitch them on is I think that we should move from this distance-based recording to meeting up 3 times a year to capture 10 video-based episodes. So that would give us 30 video forward episodes. And then we will then scatter into the feed about another 12 audio episodes over the course of the year. So we'd have kind of 3 seasons in the year of video-based episodes that we'd capture in person at these recordings. And then we would then do distance-based recording for audio episodes like this format that we would air 12 of those. And then we would then do 10 remix-based episodes where I would slap a new bumper on an older episode for our new listeners. Now, that's something a lot of podcasts, I think, they don't do a good job of. They don't reuse their material for the new audience that's grown. I always tell guys, listen, if you've got more than 100 episodes, 2 or 3 of the episodes you release on your schedule of release every year should be older episodes that you slap a new bumper on and give them kind of a fresh coat of paint. Maybe you do a little bit of trimming or editing on them. Maybe you need to cut out some dated material and introduce the new people from your audience that haven't gone back for your backlog. This is something a lot of guys, I think, just leave leave out, which is like go back and repurpose some of that material and buy yourself some weeks that are more reintroducing old material to your audience. So anyways, that's my pitch. That's what I'm coming into February.
Love it.
I got to do a hard sell on getting JT and Jen and I in the same location 3 times a year, but I think it'll be worth it. And it's really time for us to move towards a video forward positioning. So
yeah, I think it's a great pitch. So
I hope they do too.
I hope it works out. We'll find out, huh? All right. Well, we're going to jump into the EQ segment, which I have, it's a new segment for this season. I have been doing a high pass segment, but this EQ segment is where we talk about what's getting cut and what's getting boosted. So first question, what's something you're trying to cut out of your life right now?
And the podcasts are just life.
It can be up to you. You get to decide.
I'll keep it in podcast land. I love podcasts, but I have this problem where I subscribe to too many. So I'm really narrowing down, and I've made a commitment to 4 podcasts that I'm going to listen to this year.
Okay.
So I'm like, I'm going to listen to these 4 podcasts. I'm going to really pay attention to them. These are the 4 podcasts I'm listening to. If you told me, there's this great new podcast that I'm listening to, I'd go, oh, that's awesome. I'd probably write it in my notes app on my phone, and I maybe would check it out next year. But this year I'm trying to consolidate podcast land because I accumulate a lot of podcasts. So
Yeah. Do you mind me asking, what are those for?
yeah, I'll tell you. Okay, so I'm excluding Knowing Faith because I listen to those. That's work.
Sure.
That's work to listen. I listen to the Family Discipleship podcast with Adam Griffin. We launched them on our network, and now they're independent. Best family discipleship podcast out there right now. If you're into family discipleship, if you've got young kids, if you're in family ministry, if you lead a church with a lot of kids, you got to be listening to the Family Discipleship podcast. It's fantastic. So I'm going to listen to every episode they put out this year. The other podcast that I'm going to listen to every episode this season, this one is, I don't mean it to be controversial. I'm not trying to be controversial about it, but I'm going to listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, I'm not a Joe Rogan guy. But he is the biggest podcast in the world. So I'm going to listen and I know he's influencing a lot of people. I haven't listened to him a lot historically. I feel like I need to just put my ear to the ground and listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. Things Unseen with Sinclair Ferguson. I love Sinclair. He's had a huge impact on my teaching ministry. I'm going to listen to all of Sinclair's episodes. And then I'm listening. This is another one out of Ligonier. I'm doing Renewing Your Mind.
Okay.
I was a huge beneficiary, and so was my father, of R.C. Sproul's tape ministry when I was a kid, even before I knew it. And then his CD ministry, his radio ministry. So I'm going to listen to R.C. Sproul this year and really dig in on that. So those are the 4 podcasts that I'm like listening to this year.
That's great. All right. What's a practice that you're trying to boost or focus your energy and time on right now?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot more work on trying to do tricky questions. Like the season from last season in the fall and this season in the spring is all in tricky questions. One thing that I'm giving a lot of attention to this year is really trying to think through survey data that tells me what are the most common questions that people are asking.
Yeah.
So I think I'm trying to rediscover our audience again and try to grow my literacy and understanding of who they are. This has also been done through more attention to the comments in social media, trying to engage with our listeners on social media, not just so we can boost engagement, because I really do want to hear, like, what are they thinking? Like, what are they asking? I started reading every Apple podcast review and encouraging our audience to drop their big questions in the review that we could then consider for the show. That has been super fruitful to say, hey, go leave a review and leave us a question you'd want us to explore. Gosh, I'm learning a ton about what our audience is interested in that way. And so that's something I'm giving a lot more attention to. I'm keeping all of my answers in podcast land. I hope that's okay.
No, that's great. That's great. All right. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Knowing Faith has impacted their life?
There's a lot I could tell, but one I'll just tell. There's a guy, he serves at a church here in East Dallas. And the first time I met him, he came up and introduced himself to me. And I know this church really well. Adam Griffin, who's the host of Family Discipleship and one of my best friends, is the pastor of this church. And so he hired a staff member from somewhere in the Midwest. I forget where this young man's from. And this guy had come to faith, and I forget the salvation story, but he wanted to learn how to study his Bible. But he was kind of in a place where he was working long hours. I think he was driving a tractor on a farm and just was like, I need to find a way to learn. So he started Googling and he found Knowing Faith. And through Knowing Faith, he really learned how to study the Bible for himself. And it led him to wanting to go into seminary and then to pursue ministry. And so his journey was kind of like from this Midwest farm where through the gospel proclamation of somewhere he came to faith. And then he was really taught how to study the Bible and basic Christian doctrine through Knowing Faith, which gave him an interest in seminary, which brought him to Dallas, where he got hired on at a church that I just happened to be personally connected with.
That's cool.
So I loved hearing that. It's exactly one of the things that we hope the show would do, which is introduce people, welcome them in to the deeper waters of Christian discipleship, and then activate them for real participation in God's kingdom and in his church. So that is a story I love.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right. Well, Kyle, as we close our episode today, who else do you know that would be a great guest for this podcast?
If you can get Rebecca to come on, Rebecca McLaughlin from Confronting Christianity.
Yeah.
Here's why Rebecca would be great on. Here's why you could picture this way.
Okay.
And she'll know, you can say, Kyle Worley told me to tell you this. Rebecca did not want to do a podcast. I begged Rebecca to do a podcast. I wanted her to do it. And then eventually I said, Rebecca, will you do it if I host it? If I host the podcast with you, will you do the podcast? She said yes. And that first year, she didn't trust herself. So she kind of saw me as the expert running the podcast, and she was there. After that first year, I told her, Rebecca, you can do this on your own. You don't need me anymore. You go. Go do Confronting Christianity. And she's still doing it, and it's better than ever. She found her voice doing it. She would be a great person to have on as I'm a reluctant podcaster. Like, I do not want to do it. She didn't believe in it. Didn't think she could do it. Now she's doing it on her own. She's doing it better than ever. She's got a wonderful voice, an incredible podcast. So yeah, Rebecca would be a great person to have on.
Nice. Well, thank you for that recommendation. And thank you so much for being on the show today, Kyle, to share your podcasting journey and what you've learned along the way. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for being prepared. You clearly, you know what make podcasts work. It was so fun and so easy to do. So thanks for having me, Tim.
Thank you, Kyle. Have a good day, man.
You too.
Man, I really enjoyed my conversation with Kyle, getting to hear his backstory on the pitch to start the podcast that's now become a ministry and has impacted so many people all over the world. You can listen to Knowing Faith with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with J.R. Briggs. He's a speaker, teacher, author, coach, consultant, and host of the Resilient Leaders podcast with J.R. Briggs. We're going to talk about why he started his podcast in the height of COVID, why asking better questions is so important, and how he prepares for his weekly solo teaching episodes. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.